Hey guys, what's up? It's Finch here. Today we're going to be doing a bit of an analytical video on Scarlet and Violet Overused, as well as other competitive singles metagames, and it's going to stem off of usage statistics. See, right here we have the usage statistics for the month of January. That leads to the tier shifts for February in the Scarlet and Violet Overused metagame, the flagship singles metagame that you see all over Smogon and Pokemon Showdown. If you don't know what OU is, basically it's the metagame that is the most played, the most central. Only Pokemon that aren't allowed in it are Ubers, which are Pokemon that are deemed too strong. In OU, we have a lot of, the most common phases of competitive Pokemon. In this generation, things like Great Tusk and Goldengo, for example. Normally we see, the most used Pokemon maybe at 30, 35, even 40% usage, but this generation we see two Pokemon above that 40% threshold. In fact, Great Tusk is even above 50%, sitting at 53.02%. Earlier in last generation, we had the first generation with the so-called Dexit, in that we had a lot of Pokemon not in the game. So we only had a couple hundred Pokemon to pick from. So we're in the same position this generation, and at the start of last generation, we saw Clefable on virtually every team. Now we see Great Tusk on 53% of teams. And if we were to go in tournaments, then it would be on over 75% of teams, which is just crazy. Obviously, ladder tournaments, same tier, but some slight differences, and all in all, Great Tusk is a Pokemon you'll see on far more teams than not in a high-level competitive arena. Why is that, and is that a problem? Well, it depends. It's actually a more complicated question. See, usage doesn't mean something is a problem, but usage also doesn't mean that it isn't a problem either. Great Tusk is a Pokemon that is used so much because it's great against certain other Pokemon in the metagame. For example, without Great Tusk, it'd be really hard to switch into things like Chien-Pao's Crunch, King Gambit, or even Garganacl and Ting-Lu as well. Ruination, for example, with spikes, can really add up over time, but Great Tusk can eventually negate that damage with leftovers while also being a rapid spinner that threatens potential blockers such as Goldengo. Moreover, Great Tusk also has access to great utility moves that aren't very common. Knockoff saw a big drop-off in distribution. Great Tusk has Knockoff. Stealth Rocks, you see them more on defensive Pokemon like Garganacl, Ting-Lu, Glamora, Garchomp, for example. However, Great Tusk can do that while providing offense. Want more? Rapid Spin is great for removing hazards, and it possesses it while threatening things like Goldengo, as we mentioned, but you pair Rapid Spin, which boosts your speed, with Bulk Up, and it can become a makeshift sweeper. It does all these things, while providing a premium defensive typing, the ground type, which you need on every team to be immune to Volt Switch, and the fighting type to resist things like Dark, which, again, very common. Couple this with the fact that it really puts it all together in one, and you kind of see it being a behemoth of the overused metagame. Something that we see on quite a lot of teams. For example, in these games we'll be playing in the background, you'll see it's on both these teams here. However, that isn't all there is to it. You see all these things we discussed about the phenomenon of Great Tusk in the overused metagame, is that none of these things, described if it has counters or not. And the fact of the matter is that, yeah, Great Tusk has a lot of counters. If we go back to these usage stats that we just alluded to over here, you'll see things like Rotom Wash, Corviknight, Dondozo, Azumarill Aqua Jet, Pelipper, Amoonguss, Hatterene, all beat it pretty comfortably. Add on to that things like Breloom being able to beat it 1v1, Greninja being able to outpace it, both the Tauros forms, a ton of different Terra users, Dragonite, especially if it's a Hurricane variant, being able to beat it, the list goes on and on and on. The fact of the matter is that Great Tusk isn't conventionally broken at all. However, it's a Pokemon that we see being used so much. And this brings you to a comparison that anyone who's played for longer than one generation knows, and that comparison is Landorus-T, where last generation at times, while it settled in the 30s or 40s, did see over 50% usage as well, even later on in the generation. But it was largely doing so with sets that weren't menacing, weren't threatening, just Stealth Rock, Earthquake, Toxic, or Knockoff U-turn sets with physical defense or special defense investment. It provided Intimidate, it provided Pivoting, it provided a great check to electric types that now lacked hidden power, and it was a really all-around great Pokemon, considering the fact that, it was able to blank Volt Switch, it was able to blank Earthquake, it was able to provide, hazard control management and pivoting, while status and item displacement, all of these awesome tributes. But it wasn't broken. Even when you ran a Swords Dance, despite the 145 base attack, it was easily revenge killed by things like Weavile's Ice Shard, or walled by things like Buzzwole, Skarmory, revenge killed by Dragapult. It had plenty of offensive and defensive counterplay. Was it strong? Sure, it was a strong, good, competent Pokemon, but it wasn't broken. So why is it that it and Great Tusk were used so much. And why is this usage so polarizing? Well, it's used so much because they're reacting to things the metagame lacks. In the Scarlet and Violet tier, as we discussed before, there aren't many other Rapid Spinners or hazard removals altogether that can stand at the Goldango, the second most used Pokemon, which we might get on later. On top of that, there aren't many other ground types. Sure, we see things like Garchomp, but it can't do all that Great Tusk does. Same that Ting-Lu. Ting-Lu's a primarily defensive Pokemon. And then it starts making sense. Okay, Great Tusk provides a certain premium to my team that the metagame kind of carved out this all-encompassing role for it, that it's just that good. And let's say we were to ban the most used Pokemon in this generation or last generation and remove Great Tusk. Suddenly, King Gambit and its Sucker Punch and Cocktune Cleave become a lot more threatening. Chien-Pao's Crunch, forget about it, and that's already a suspect, you know? Suddenly Volt Switch roams free, hazards are up to stay for good. All these things happen, you know? Suddenly we'd probably have to ban things like Garganacl and King Gambit. Chien-Pao would go even quicker. Cinderace would be much more threatening. You know, the list goes on and on and on. The fact of the matter is that these Pokemon aren't used so much because they're broken. Sometimes they could be, but not in this instance, or Landorus-T. They're used so much because they're glue that holds teams together so you could use them with offensive Pokemon. Because team styles like Hyper Offense and Bulky Offense and Balance use these Pokemon to compress roles together so that they could use the ideas in Pokemon they want to use alongside them. So, is usage necessarily meaning something's evil or negative? No, not at all. Quite on the contrary, Great Tusk is one of the best additions, one of the most exciting and enjoyable new Pokemon from an overuse standpoint, and we should all embrace it in the metagame. Nothing short of this, nothing more than it. Same goes for Goldango in some senses. Goldango is the second most used Pokemon. We see it here. It's already fainted, unfortunately, but it is a Pokemon that is great. Nasty Plot is pretty threatening, good as gold, you know, it can deter some things, but it still provides some roles. Maybe not as limited, though. And that's when you start going down the usage list, and you see things like Chien-Pao, Dragonite, Iron Valiant. You know, these Pokemon, they aren't really used on virtually every team at a high level. They're used, you know, every third, every fourth team for some of them. Goldango a little more so, but they're Pokemon that maybe aren't necessarily reactionary so much as they are the action themselves. And that's why a lot more offensive Pokemon end up being the focus of suspect tests, in that when you force something like Great Tusk or Landorus-T or Toxapex or Slowbro or whatever it is over the past couple generations to be such high usage, that limits team building, that restricts team building. And when an offensive Pokemon does that so much, team building gets boring, the game gets overly repetitive, and we start seeing trends like this. And the Pokemon that force these trends aren't necessarily the trends themselves, aren't necessarily Pokemon that sit at 53.02% usage like Great Tusk, but rather the Pokemon that forced them to be used, that forced the metagame to be limited. And ultimately the objective of tiering is to make it so that these Pokemon seldom exist, that team building is open. And while we might have one or two crutches, like Great Tusk or Goldango, not every team is the same 4 or 5 or 6 Pokemon, so that we see a wider, more spread out usage. So eventually you're going to start seeing, you know, number 3 in usage go from 33% to 30% to 25% over time. And we'll start seeing, you know, more Pokemon in OU than just 37, maybe 40 or 45, just as the generation goes on. Things like Pokemon Home will also help with this, as we're going to be seeing more Pokemon that naturally bring more checks and counters to the metagame, as well as more offensive options. Diversifying team building, making so that new archetypes and styles and synergy all be found in this metagame. All in all, usage stats are an interesting case study in what is used and why it is used. Because a lot of people look at it and just say, oh my god, this is used so much, we should get rid of it, it's boring. When in reality, the things that prompt it are what really is the cause for this boringness and repetitiveness. And we should be looking at those Pokemon as suspect, if you will. We should be looking at those Pokemon as the true catalysts, not Great Tusk. In Great Tusk, the fact of the matter is it has more than enough counters, as we alluded to before. Chien-Pao, not so much, you know. You go down the list, Garganacl, maybe not so much as well. And unfortunately, in that instance, it gets really tough, because we see people who say usage must equate to brokenness, but then the fact of the matter is that the most used things aren't always broken, but sometimes the 3rd, or the 8th, or the 12th, or the 22nd most used thing is broken. And that's why I just dislike that concept altogether. Usage very, very infrequently has correlation to brokenness, and I just say, hey, I don't care how much you use, I care, you know, how good you are, how I consider you in the team builder in the battle, and the like. And that's how I draw these conclusions. I hope this helped give some perspective on why things like Landorus-T have never been banned, and things like Great Tusk are unlikely to be banned in the immediate future. Obviously, anything can change. It could turn out to be broken, but it's just not the case, and we'll have to wait and see. And again, there can be a Pokemon that's just so crazily good that it is not only the most used Pokemon or used on every team, but also it happens to be broken. But odds are things like those will get removed like day one. Things like Fluttermane, for example, which saw so much usage that even weeks later it still stayed in the high usage charts despite getting banned. And things like those. But we don't really have those in any balanced metagames, and that's thankful. You know, we'd have to go back to things like Snorlax to see usage that high, or maybe Tyranitar and ADV. And so on and so forth. But yeah, let me know what you think. Do you think that Pokemon like Landorus-T and Great Tusk are good for the metagame or bad for the metagame? And why? Thank you so much for watching. These are the usage stats for for January, heading into the February tier shift that we are discussing, I suppose. If you guys are interested, you can find them on Smogon's Twitter. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Okay, bye now.